Hi, my name's Susan Glenn, and we're going to have a little presentation on how globally the patterns of climate are going to impact the distribution of biomes. And I am using the textbook Ecology, Concepts and Applications that was written in 2019 by Manuel Molles and Anna Sher and published by McGraw Hill. And in order to understand where we find the different biomes, it's important to understand where we find the different types of climate, because climate is the most important factor in understanding the distribution of biomes. The combination of temperature and water availability is going to influence where the plants are, and where the plants are is clearly going to influence where the animals are, what their habitat is, what their food is. So, for example, regardless of the continent, a desert will have certain plants that have certain functional traits that make them well suited for that environment. And that has arisen through selective pressure in the desert environment, where the ones that were containing the traits that made them survive in that environment were the ones that were able to stay there. Biomes are defined by the average temperature and precipitation in an area, and this diagram was adapted from work by Whitaker. And what we have here is on the x-axis, the average annual temperature, uh, and degrees Celsius, and on the y-axis we have the average annual precipitation in centimeters. And in different places, if depending on their temperature and their precipitation, you will find a different biome. The little diagram up in the top left corner is actually showing you the data Whitaker used to make this diagram. Each of the blue dots was a different place he went to, and then he drew the little boundaries based on what types of biomes he found in those places. The other thing to notice in this diagram is that there are fuzzy lines between the different types of biomes, because there are other factors that come into play, such as soil or the location of mountains blocking rainfall, that will mean that you might have the same temperature and precipitation in a spot, but depending on where on the landscape you fall, you're going to have a different biome because of these other factors. The large-scale patterns in climatic variation, and this will help us understand why we find the biomes, where we find the biomes. The sun heats up some parts of the earth much more intensely than other parts of the earth, so we can have some very predictable variations. We also have the earth is on an angle. The axis is not straight up and down, but it's tilted at 23.5 degrees. And so that also adds a certain amount of variation that we call the seasons into our climate. So we have variation depending on the latitude, so we can go from latitudes around the equator where we're at 0 latitude up to a latitude of 90 degrees at the North Pole and 90 degrees down here at the South Pole. So we have getting cooler as we go up and down from the equator, but then we also have seasonal variability. Temperatures are usually pretty constant in the equatorial regions, so there's less variability around the equator, whereas obviously you have more temperature variability as you go towards the north or south poles. But the rainfall can be very seasonal in the equatorial regions. Overall, we know that deserts are going to receive little precipitation, so if we can understand where precipitation falls and where it doesn't fall, we might be able to predict where we would find the deserts. So because the Earth is a sphere, then we have unequal heating because of the shape of the Earth, and also because it's on an angle, some parts of the earth are going to be getting more direct heat than others. So the sun's rays are more concentrated when the sun is directly overhead. So if we're looking at the earth, and it's tilted, and we've got the sun over here, shining on. If it's directly overhead, then you're going to have all the sun's rays concentrated on that one spot. If it's not directly overhead, in the winter we look and we see that it's kind of low on the horizon in the sky, then we can see those same sun rays are spread out over a larger area, and so you have less concentrated heat hitting the surface. So the latitude where the sun is directly overhead is also going to change because of the tilt of the axis of the Earth. So sometimes the southern hemisphere has the sun directly overhead, and other times the northern hemisphere, north of the equator, has the sun directly overhead. The tilt of the axis is 23.5 degrees from perpendicular. So that means if we had the axis was at 90 degrees, it's just been tilted off 23.5 degrees from straight up and down. The YouTube site SciShow has some great videos. I highly recommend taking a look at all their different channels. And I think they did a really good job with their animation showing you how, because of the tilt of the Earth, at certain points of the year, you have more direct sunlight reaching an area than you do at other times of the year. So we can see here in the Northern Hemisphere in the summertime, we can see the Northern Hemisphere is facing the sun more directly, so it's getting much more direct sun rays on the Northern Hemisphere, whereas they're going to be more spread out in the Southern Hemisphere. In our winter time, you can see the rays coming off of the sun are going to be spread out over a larger area, so they're going to be much cooler than if you're down in the hemisphere. They're going to be much more concentrated. So on the first day of winter, this is when you can see that the sun is going to be directly overhead this point on the southern hemisphere. This first day of winter is going to be their first day of summer. And on the first day of summer in the southern hemisphere, the sun is directly overhead the point that is at the latitude 23.5 degrees south is going to be where the sun is directly overhead. And that latitude is called the Tropic of Capricorn. Our first day of summer is when the sun is directly overhead 23.5 degrees north, which is the Tropic of Cancer. So the Tropic of Cancer is at 23.5 degrees north. The Tropic of Capricorn is at 23.5 degrees south. The first day of what we would call fall, so we're going from, we would call fall, so we're going from summer towards winter. We're right in this spot. The sun is directly overhead the equator, which is 0 degrees latitude. And then the first day of spring, the sun is once again directly overhead the equator, which is 0 degrees latitude. When the sun is directly overhead the equator, everyone on the planet, no matter where they are, have 12 hours of daylight on the first day of spring and 12 hours of daylight on the first day of fall. And that doesn't matter where you live on the planet, you're going to have 12 hours. But it doesn't mean it's going to be the same temperature everywhere, because obviously it's much more concentrated over the equator than elsewhere. So when we're going from season to season, we can see where the sun is directly overhead will vary at different spots on the Earth. So it's going to be moving from being directly overhead the equator to being directly overhead the Tropic of Cancer, then directly overhead the equator, and then directly overhead the Tropic of Capricorn. So these changes in where the sun is are going to result in changes in temperatures in different places. And changes in temperatures is going to cause changes to the air. When you think about air warming up, the air is going to expand when it warms up. All those little molecules of air, as it heats up, they're going to start moving faster. And they're going to, when they move faster, when they've heated up, they're going to push each other further apart. And so the air will expand with the heat. So as the air is expanding with heat, you can imagine then it's moving. It's going to push it out from one place to another. So that is what's going to cause your wind and your atmospheric circulation. Also, as it heats up, there's more room in between these molecules to put a water molecule. And when you're doing that, that's going to mean that the air can hold more moisture. And then if it goes somewhere where it cools down, those far apart water molecules will move, or air molecules will move closer together, and your water is going to condense to make your clouds, and it'll start to rain. So because of the shape of the Earth being a sphere and the tilt of the axis, it causes uneven heating. This drives the air circulation patterns, which we call Hadley cells, and that's going to influence where precipitation falls. Remember, where some precipitation falls, you might get a tropical rainforest. If there's no precipitation falling, you may be able to get a desert in that area. We know that warm, moist air rises. Then it's going to, as it rises, as you move away from the surface of the Earth, the air is getting thinner, it's much cooler. Then when it's cooler, then those water droplets are going to condense into clouds and fall as rain. That cooler, drier air then is going to be heavier. Because it's cooler, it's more condensed, and it's going to sink back to the surface. So you're going to have cool, dry air coming to the surface. Dry air, desert. So because of that, rainforests are going to be found near the equator. Near the equator is where this warm air is rising, full of precipitation. As it gets up high, it's going to cool, condense, and fall as rain. But there's still more warm air rising that's going to force the cooler air to go north and south of the equator, and you find major deserts near 30 degrees north and 30 degrees south latitude. So let me just draw a little diagram. Here's the surface of the Earth. Up here in the sky, we have the sun. Maybe make that redder so you can see it. And so as the sun's rays are coming down onto the surface of the Earth, we can see the air is going to start heating up, and it's going to push the molecules further apart so it becomes less dense, and that warm air is going to start to rise. With it, it's evaporating the water in it, so we're holding lots of water in that air. And as it rises, as we go up higher in the atmosphere, the air is less dense, so it's going to start to cool, and that water is going to form little rain clouds, and so you're going to start to get the rain falling here. So if we're like at the first day of spring or the first day of fall, if we are on the equator here, so let's say this is equator, so it's 0 degrees latitude of the equator. Now, there's still more air warming up and coming up here. That's going to push this air that's raining up here. It's going to push it north and south. So let's just say that this is going north and this direction is going south. It's going to push that air that way. But that air is getting cooler, and because that air is getting cooler, it's going to start sinking back towards the surface. So that cooler air is being pushed back north and south from the equator because there's still more air coming up from the equator. And then as it's going back down to the earth, now we have, when you think about air sinking, pushing on the surface of the earth, we have a high pressure system right there. High pressure, high pressure. This air is going up away from the surface. It's going to be low pressure. Get lots of rain with low pressure. You don't get rain with high pressure. That's air high in the atmosphere pushing down. It's dry. So if we've got dry air pushing down to the surface of the earth, we're likely to get a desert here and a desert here. And that's around 30 degrees latitude north and 30 degrees latitude south. Latitude. And just remember, latitude, when we're looking at the earth, the equator is at 0 degrees latitude, and then it's about 30 degrees latitude north. The North Pole is at 90, and then 30 degrees latitude south. And the South Pole is at 90 south, 90 north. This is north, this is south. Now, this air that's pushing down, that is forming the desert here because it's very dry air. Now there's still more air pushing down. This is still coming up. This is still going this way. It's still pushing down. When it hits the surface, it has to go somewhere. So some of it moves back to the equator where it heats up. And so you form this circle right here of air movement like that, going that way. And we get another circle. This will go down, go back to the equator of air movement that way. Not all the air will go back to the equator. Some of it's going to move across, and you actually form another circle over here, and some's going to go across. You're going to form another circle over there. Get those guys out of the way. Another circle over here, going in that direction. This circle of air is called a Hadley cell. This one whoops, I'm writing with the eraser. Hadley cell. This one here is the Hadley cell. And so the Hadley cells are going to determine where that precipitation is falling. So we have the wet area here. It's going to determine where the dry areas are. So we got a desert here and a desert here and something kind of in between here. So you might have a tropical rainforest at the equator and then a tropical dry forest on either side of it, or savanna grasslands, tropical grasslands on either side of it, depending on the soil type. The other thing to remember that the sun is not always directly overhead the equator. So sometimes the sun is going to be directly overhead the Tropic of Cancer or the Tropic of Capricorn or somewhere in between that. Because of that, this location of where this rainfall is falling is going to change as the Hadley cells move further north. As the sun becomes moving towards the Tropic of Cancer, you're going to start to see the rainfall will move in that direction. And then other times of the year, the rainfall is going to be heading down towards the Tropic of Capricorn. That means the location of this rain is going to change. And if the location of this rain is going to change, some places are going to have seasonal rains in the tropics, which we call monsoons. This is a much better picture of what I was trying to draw on the last slide. This is the one out of your textbook drawn by a professional artist. But once again, we can see at the equator here, we've got the heavy rainfall. So the air was rising at the equator. It cooled and condensed into the clouds. and then it fell in the form of rain. That air is being pushed to the north and south up high, where as it exhausts its rain, it starts to cool and it drops back down to the surface. And then when it falls down to the surface, you get the deserts forming around 30 degrees latitude north and south of the equator. And this location where this heavy rain is falling can shift to the north or south depending on where the sun is directly overhead, because the sun sometimes is going to be directly overhead further north or further south, depending on where the Earth is in its orbit around the sun. The other thing to notice here is that where these Hadley cells are located, we have wind. Sometimes the wind is going to be across the surface, and we feel those winds. And so we got winds going from where the air is going down to the desert towards the equator. And then we have other surface winds going the opposite direction away from the equator. There's also very high winds, which airplanes are aware of as they are traveling from place to place. They're going to adjust where they're flying so that they're not flying into those headwinds. The diagram on the lower right is going to be showing you the distribution of these air circulation cells across the planet. And so here we can see at the equator, we have this Hadley cell that's going up to the north of the equator, and where it falls down, we have in northern Africa, we have the Sahara Desert being formed there. And where all that rainfall fell around the equator, we have tropical rainforest. So you can see how the biomes are going to be determined by the location of these Hadley cells. Remember that another cell would be forming further north than that. That's this cell right here. And then there's a third cell that drops down dry air straight onto the North Pole. And so the North Pole is also a desert. We get the same thing happening in the southern hemisphere. Hadley cell dropping dry air around 30 degrees south, and that is the Kalahari Desert in the southern tip of Africa. We get another Hadley cell next to that further south, and then another cell, and then a third cell that is all the way dropping dry air onto the South Pole in addition. So if we look back at our map of the biomes, we can see on that map is located the equator, which is 0 degrees latitude north. We have the Tropic of Cancer, which we now know is 23.5 degrees north, and we have the Tropic of Capricorn, which is 23.5 degrees north. They also mark in here the Arctic Circle. The Arctic Circle is 60 degrees north, and if you're above the Arctic Circle during the summertime, you can have 24 hours of sunlight because the top of the Earth is tilted towards the sun. But when we look at this and we look at the different biomes, we can take the desert biome, which is the bright yellow, and we can see a band of desert around 30 degrees north. There's deserts 30 degrees north and 30 degrees south, so that we can sort of start to see a pattern in these biomes. The tropical rainforest, which is red, we can see around the tropics. We've got the tropical rainforest in South America, we've got the tropical rainforest in Africa, and then we have the tropical rainforest in Southeast Asia. If you're unfamiliar with maps as you're going through this course and we're talking about a place that you don't know where it is, take a little bit of time, look things up, figure out where things are. You should be able to identify all the continents on this map. You should be able to identify the equator, the Tropic of Cancer and Capricorn. You should know where the different latitudes are falling on the continents. Now, remember I said the surface winds are pretty predictable from this. If the sun is directly overhead the equator, we know we have surface winds coming, heading back towards the equator. But if you look on this particular map of where these surface winds are, we can see the surface winds are actually not going straight south to the equator, but they are tilted, and they're going from the northeast to southwest. And the same thing for the winds going back to the equator from the 30 degrees south from that Hadley cell, they're tilted. They're not going straight north back to the equator. This tilting is because the Earth is spinning underneath the air. So the air is actually going straight back, but to us it feels like it's going on an angle. And this is called the Coriolis effect. It's apparent from our perspective on the surface is a deflection of the wind. So they're deflected to the right in the northern hemisphere, and they're deflected to the left in the southern hemisphere. So if you're traveling from the desert, the Sahara Desert down to, if you're traveling from the Sahara Desert down to the equator, and the Earth is spinning beneath you, this spot that you were heading for would have already moved over, so it looks like you're traveling on an angle. We call these winds, these surface winds, the trade winds, because they were very important for people that were traveling in sailing ships during trading times. And so you can imagine that it might have been very important to understand where these winds fell and how they changed over the course of the year, depending on where the sun was directly overhead. So if you were leaving from Europe and you were going to North America, you wouldn't want to go straight across the North Atlantic. You would want to go down the coast of Africa, and that way when you went across you'd have the wind more at your back. And then if you're going back to go up here to Boston and then we go back to Europe, you'd want to stay where the wind is at your back. So understanding how these points where the wind's directions change over the course of the year was very important for when you were doing sailing ships around the world. At this point, you should be able to answer these concept review questions. You have enough information. How would seasonality and temperature and precipitation be affected if the Earth was not tilted 23.5 degrees from perpendicular to the orbit around the sun? And what is the rainy season in regions near 23 degrees north latitude begin in June, which would be the monsoon season? We're going to be talking next about the variation throughout the year in climate. That will be done by looking at climate diagrams, so you can join us for the next video. See you there.